They said we were an infestation, a weed spreading through the galaxy that needed to be cut down. And Admiral Keyes, standing on the bridge of his flagship, was the man holding the shears. Behind him stretched a fleet so vast it blotted out the stars. 9,700 warships and 2 million soldiers ready to burn our world to a cinder. He believed this would be his grandest victory. In reality, it was the beginning of his end. What you're about to hear is the story of how humanity, a species they dismissed as divided and weak, taught the most powerful empire in the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Their intelligence reports painted a perfect picture of an easy target. Humans, a species barely 300 years out of the cradle, with primitive ships and weapons a child could disable. But their biggest mistake was seeing our differences as a weakness. They saw hundreds of nations, thousands of languages, and a history of fighting among ourselves, and they thought they'll never unite. They couldn't have been more wrong. They didn't understand that while siblings might fight, they will always, always band together against an outsider. Convinced of our weakness, Admiral Keyes confidently walked to the tactical display, where a glowing hologram of our solar system hung in the air. Earth, a tiny blue marble, looked so fragile. Our small colonies on Mars, our mining stations in the asteroid belt, our little research outposts on distant moons. He saw them all as future trophies for his empire. "Status report," he commanded, his voice dripping with arrogance. His second, Vthara, stepped forward. "All ships are in position, Admiral. We are ready to jump." "And the humans?" Keyes asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "Do they have any idea we're coming?" Vthara shook her head. "None, Admiral. Their detection systems are a joke. They won't see us until we're on their doorstep." Chaos savored the moment. This was too easy. The humans would see his armada and surrender without a fight. They'd either bow peacefully or die foolishly. Either way, he'd be celebrated as a hero back home. He keyed the comms, his voice booming across every ship in the fleet. "Warriors of the Dominion," he began, his voice echoing in the helmets of 2 million soldiers. "Today, we bring enlightenment to a lost species. The humans are young, reckless, and in desperate need of our guidance. They fight amongst themselves because they lack our strength, our unity, our rule." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Some may resist. That is the way of children, but we will be patient, we will be firm, and we will show them that fighting back is utterly pointless. For the Dominion." A roar of approval echoed through the fleet as Chaos gave the order, "Begin the jump." Reality itself seemed to warp around his 9,700 ships. 4 hours later, they burst back into normal space at the edge of our solar system. And on Earth, in a quiet monitoring station in Chile, Dr. Sarah Chen dropped her lunch. She was used to a boring job watching for asteroids. But this wasn't an asteroid. It was a fleet. And it was alien. Her hands trembled as she stared at the impossible numbers on her screen. Thousands of energy signatures appearing out of thin air. They weren't ours. They were moving too fast, burning too bright. She fumbled for her phone, first calling her supervisor, then the government emergency line. In a matter of minutes, her little outpost in the mountains became the nerve center of the world, broadcasting a single, terrifying message to every government on the planet. The news hit like a tidal wave. In Washington, President Martinez was yanked from a tedious budget meeting. In Beijing, Chairman Wu was shaken awake. In Moscow, President Volkov got the call during his own daughter's birthday party. From London to New Delhi, the message was the same. We are not alone, and our first visitors have brought an army. Panic set in. Some leaders argued for immediate surrender. Others swore to fight to the last person. The world teetered on the brink of chaos. Then, someone spoke a name that hadn't been uttered in military circles for years. Elena Vasquez. General Vasquez had been retired for 5 years, living a quiet life tending her garden in a small house in Argentina. At 73, she was a legend who had fought in 3 wars and never lost a single battle. She was known for her brilliant, unorthodox mind and an absolute refusal to ever accept defeat. When they found her among her roses and told her what was happening, the tired look in her eyes vanished, replaced by a blazing fire. She was flown to an emergency session at the United Nations in New York. The room was thick with fear. Presidents, generals, and scientists all looked lost. Vasquez, in her simple civilian clothes, walked to the front of the room, her calm presence cutting through the panic. "I've read the reports," she said, her voice steady and clear. 9,700 ships. 2 million soldiers. They expect us to be divided. They expect us to surrender. She looked at the faces staring back at her, from the Russian president to the American general. Then, a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. They have absolutely no idea who they're dealing with. The Russian president leaned into his microphone. "General, with all due respect, our weapons can't even scratch their ships. How can we possibly fight them?" "You're right," Vasquez agreed, nodding. "In a fair fight, we'd be annihilated. Our ships are slow, our guns are weak. So," she said, pressing a button to bring up a hologram of the solar system, "we're not going to fight fair. We're going to fight the human way." She zoomed in on the asteroid belt. "For 200 years, we've been moving these rocks around with thousands of automated drones. What if, instead of mining them, we weaponize them? We're going to turn the entire asteroid belt into a minefield of projectiles moving at 30 kilometers per second." A stunned silence fell over the room. "And that's just the beginning," she continued, her eyes gleaming. "In the next 3 days, every moon, every station, every piece of junk orbiting every planet in this system becomes a weapon. We will use their straight-line approach against them. We will give them a welcome they never expected." President Martinez finally spoke up. "General, even if it works, they still outnumber us. How do we actually win?" Vasquez's gaze hardened. "Mr. President, wars aren't won by the side with the bigger guns. They're won by the side that refuses to quit, by the side willing to do whatever it takes to survive." She looked at every leader in that room. "So I ask you, are you willing to pay that price?" A silent, determined nod rippled through the assembly. And so it began. 3 days later, as Admiral Keys's fleet confidently entered the asteroid belt, his perfect invasion turned into a nightmare. The universe itself seemed to attack him, as thousands of rocks, guided by our tiny drones, slammed into his fleet. Shields shattered, hulls buckled. Arrogance turned to shock, then to fear. They came expecting a broken people. They found a united world that had turned its own home into a fortress, proving that the human spirit, when pushed into a corner, is the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. Imagine getting a notice that in just 3 days, an alien empire is coming to wipe you out. They think you're weak, divided, and an easy conquest. But they just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Stick with me to see how humanity turned the tables. A leader stood before her people, her voice ringing with defiance as she clenched her fist. We don't surrender. We don't give up. We fight, and we win. In that moment, the world united. All across the planet, a single massive plan kicked into gear. The aliens were coming, but they had absolutely no idea what they were about to walk into. Aboard the flagship, Admiral Catharis watched his fleet glide through the asteroid belt, bored and impatient. His soldiers were itching for a fight, hungry for glory. Oh, they were about to get a taste of something, all right. But it wasn't going to be glory. Admiral, his second-in-command, Vithara, reported, we're picking up some odd movements in the asteroid field. Catharis barely looked up. What kind of movements? Vithara hesitated, staring at her screen. Small objects, sir. Lots of them. They're changing their flight paths, and it looks like they're pushing the bigger asteroids around. Catharis finally frowned. Pushing them where? Vithara's face went white. Sir, they're setting them on a direct collision course with our fleet. The Admiral let out a hearty laugh. Asteroids! They seriously think they can stop us with rocks? He waved a dismissive hand. Let the point defense systems handle it. Full steam ahead. And so, 200 of his lead ships plunged deeper into the belt, their cannons ready to blast any stray rock to dust. They never imagined there could be too many. See, for 3 straight days, humanity's greatest minds had been working, fueled by coffee and desperation. They'd hacked and reprogrammed every single automated mining drone in the entire asteroid belt. These thousands of little machines, designed to gently nudge asteroids for mining, were given a new, single-minded purpose. They latched onto giant rocks and fired their engines at full blast. It started slowly, but soon, a calculated storm of asteroids was hurtling through space, each trajectory perfectly planned. The first one, moving at a blistering 32 kilometers per second, slammed into the Valkyrie cruiser named Bright Sword. The ship's shields flared a brilliant blue, straining to hold. And then they shattered. The massive rock tore through the warship's hull like a cannonball through a tin can, and the Bright Sword vanished in a silent, fiery explosion. Before anyone could react, another ship was hit. Then another, and another. Admiral Catharis stared in horror as his tactical map lit up like a Christmas tree, each light a dying ship. His powerful, beautiful fleet was being shredded by rocks, simple, stupid rocks. All ships, take evasive action, he roared. Fire the point defense cannons, destroy those things now. His fleet scrambled. Lasers sliced through the darkness, vaporizing smaller asteroids, but the big ones just kept coming. For every rock they managed to destroy, the humans had already sent 2 more on an unchangeable path. They lost 40 ships in the first 10 minutes, then 60, then 100. Catharis gripped the bridge railing so tight his knuckles turned bone white. This was impossible. It was humiliating. "Push through," he commanded, his voice strained. "Get us out of this death trap." The fleet gunned their engines, trying to outrun the storm of stone and ice. Some of them made it. A lot of them didn't. By the time the battered survivors broke through the other side of the belt, 240 of his ships were gone. 240 warships, destroyed without ever seeing the enemy. Beaten by drones, rocks, and human ingenuity. Catharis stood in stunned silence, just staring at the numbers on the screen. He'd arrived with 9,700 ships. Now, he had 9,460. It was a small fraction of his total force, but it was a blow he never saw coming, a loss that should have been impossible. For the first time, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout in his heart. The fleet pressed on toward Mars. As the red planet loomed larger, Catharis braced for a fight. He expected ship-to-ship combat, planetary defenses lighting up the sky. Instead, he found nothing. The Martian colonies were ghost towns. The humans had packed up and left, taking everything: ships, supplies, even their family photos. All that was left behind were empty buildings and silent, dust-swept streets. They ran, Vathara said with a smirk. They knew they couldn't hold the planet, so they tucked their tails and fled. Catharis nodded. It seemed like a logical move for a weaker species, concentrating all their forces to defend their home world. "Send down landing parties," he ordered. "See if they left anything useful behind." His soldiers explored the abandoned colonies, searching for any piece of tech or intelligence, but they found only silence. That is, until they found the tunnels. It was an accident. A soldier stepped on a weak floor panel and crashed into a hidden shaft below. It led to a massive underground complex, carved deep into the Martian rock, filled with endless rows of missiles. Nuclear missiles. Thousands upon thousands of them. The soldier who found them barely had time to scream into his radio before they all launched at once. All across the surface of Mars, hidden silo doors blasted open, and missiles erupted from the ground like a swarm of angry hornets. Their engines lit up the dark side of the planet as they rocketed toward the orbiting fleet. Each one of those missiles carried the fury of a star crammed into its warhead. Catharis watched in pure terror as thousands of tiny lights ascended from the planet, aimed directly at his ships. "Defensive positions," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Shoot them all down!" The fleet unleashed everything it had. Lasers tore through the darkness, and point defense systems fired wildly, turning hundreds of missiles into premature fireworks. But it was no use. There were just too many. Wave after wave kept coming from hidden silos all over the planet. The first nuke struck the cruiser, Silent Hunter. The explosion was blinding, a tiny sun that bloomed in space and simply erased the warship from existence, along with anything else within a kilometer. Then another detonated, and another. Catharis could only watch as his fleet was torn apart. His tactical screen was a nightmare of red alerts and casualty reports. In less than an hour, 800 more ships were gone. When the last missile was shot down and the fires began to fade, he took stock of the damage. He'd arrived at Mars with 9,460 ships. He was leaving with 8,512. He had lost nearly 1,500 ships and hadn't even reached Earth yet. The Admiral collapsed into his command chair, feeling 1,000 years old. This was not going according to plan. Vathara approached him cautiously. "Admiral, what are your orders?" Catharis stared blankly at the screen. Earth was still the target. Failure was not an option. "Continue to Earth," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We still outnumber them. We can still win this." But as the words left his lips, he realized he didn't believe them anymore. Later, alone in his quarters, Catharis drafted a message to the High Council. He had to explain the disaster without sounding like a fool. "High Council," he wrote, "I'm reporting from the Sol system. We have met unexpected resistance. The humans are far more resourceful than our intelligence suggested." He paused, trying to find the right words. "They've weaponized their entire environment. They turned an asteroid belt into a minefield, and their second planet into a missile silo. They refuse to fight us directly, instead relying on tricks, traps, and hidden weapons." He thought of the brave soldiers he'd lost, not in glorious battle, but to rocks and automated bombs. "These humans," he continued, "they don't fight with honor. They don't follow the accepted rules of war. They fight like cornered animals, using any crude advantage they can get their hands on. But the most disturbing thing is their weapons. Nuclear arms are forbidden by every civilized race in the galaxy. They are too terrible, too destructive. The humans seem to use them without a second thought. They don't just possess atomic fire, they embrace it." He shook his head, a cold dread washing over him. "I believe we have gravely underestimated this species. They are not the divided, easy prey we were promised. They are something else, something dangerous that we have never encountered before." He sent the message and sat in the dark, staring out at the stars. Earth was waiting. What other nightmares had they cooked up on their home world? What other traps were waiting for him? For the first time in his long and decorated career, Admiral Catharas was truly afraid. And back on Earth, General Vasquez read the damage reports from Mars, a grim, satisfied smile spreading across her face. Phase 2 was complete. Have you ever felt like the whole world was against you, only to find a strength you never knew you had? That's what happened to us. The aliens thought we were an easy target. They were about to learn a very hard lesson. If you want to see how a bunch of underdogs saved the planet, stick with me for a few minutes. The initial attacks, our desperate gamble with asteroids and old nukes, had worked shockingly well. The invaders lost almost 1,500 ships before they even got close. But that was just the opening act. General Vasquez stood in the command bunker, deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, a silent storm in a sea of controlled chaos. Every screen glowed with data. Every officer was a study in focus. This wasn't one country's fight. It was everyone's. American soldiers coordinated with Russian engineers, while Chinese scientists brainstormed with European coders. All our old squabbles felt like playground spats in the face of extinction. "They're 3 hours out," an officer reported, his voice tight. "Roughly 8,500 ships left." Vasquez just nodded. 8,500 ships. It was an overwhelming force, enough to shatter Earth's defenses 10 times over, enough to wipe humanity from existence if they broke through our lines. But she wasn't going to let that happen. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice calm, cutting through the hum of the command center. "Yes, General," came the crisp reply. "All weapons are hot. All shields are active. Every single unit is in position and waiting for the go word." Vasquez stared at the main tactical screen. The alien fleet was a terrifying cloud of red dots, crawling steadily toward the fragile blue marble that was home. "Good," she said, a flicker of a smile on her lips. "Let them come. We've got a few more surprises for them." Her mind drifted to the soldiers we'd lost on Mars, the brave souls who stayed behind at the missile silos, knowing it was a one-way trip. They knew they wouldn't make it back. They volunteered anyway. That was the human spirit in a nutshell. Fight until your last breath. Never, ever surrender. The aliens were about to get a crash course in stubbornness. The Valkyrie fleet blotted out the sky on a Tuesday morning. 8,000, 512 ships formed a ceiling of dark metal, casting a shadow over half the globe. People looked up from their morning coffee, from their office desks, and saw the enemy with their own eyes for the first time. Some screamed, some fell to their knees in prayer, but most just stared, paralyzed by the sheer scale of it. Aboard the alien flagship, Admiral Keith gazed down at the swirling blue and white planet. It was beautiful, he had to admit, a perfect jewel, rich with everything his dominion craved. And soon it would be theirs. He keyed the comms, broadcasting his voice on every frequency imaginable. It poured out of every radio, every TV, every phone on the planet. "People of Earth," his voice boomed, smooth and arrogant. "I am Admiral Keith of the Velkari Dominion. I am here to offer you peace." He paused for dramatic effect. "Your resistance has been spirited. You've shown a primitive cleverness that the Dominion can respect. We don't wish to destroy you. We wish to guide you, to elevate you to your proper place in the galaxy." He spread his arms wide in a parody of a welcoming gesture. "Surrender now, and you will be treated with mercy. Your people will be spared. Your quaint cultures will be preserved in our archives. You will join a galactic community spanning thousands of light years." He dropped his arms, his tone turning to ice. "Refuse, and you will be erased. The choice is yours. You have 1 hour." The transmission ended. He leaned back in his command chair, utterly certain they would fold. They had fought bravely for a backwater species, but they had to see that this was the end of the line. He couldn't have been more wrong. In the Colorado bunker, General Vasquez listened as silence fell over the room. Leaders from every nation on Earth watched her, their faces grim. The entire weight of human history, of every war fought, every life lost, every dream dreamed, settled onto her shoulders. She thought of her grandmother, who told her stories of surviving a war as a little girl. She thought of her father, who'd given 30 years of his life to the military. And she thought of her daughter, probably in a shelter right now, holding her 2 small children, trying to be brave for them. What kind of future was she fighting for? Then, her decision made, she reached for the microphone. "Admiral Keith," she said, her voice steady as a rock. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I speak for the unified people of Earth." She took a deep breath. "We have received your offer. We've considered your words. And our answer is no." She glanced at the swarm of red dots on the screen. "You call us young, primitive. You see our history of fighting amongst ourselves, and you call it weakness. You couldn't be more wrong." Her voice began to rise, filled with a fire that spread through the room. "We've been fighting each other for 10,000 years. We have survived plagues, famines, and disasters that would have shattered 1,000 other species. We crawled out of the dirt and reached for the stars with nothing but our own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to lie down and die." She curled her hand into a fist. "You think you can scare us with your big ships and shiny guns? You think we'll just kneel? We will never surrender. We will never kneel. We will fight you with every missile, every bullet, and every ship we have. And when they're all gone, we'll fight you with our bare hands." She leaned closer to the mic, her voice dropping to a deadly, serious whisper. "This is our home. You are not welcome here. That is our answer." With a click, she cut the transmission. All around the world, In bunkers and basements, in subway stations and shelters, people heard her voice. And for the first time in history, there were no Americans or Russians or Chinese. There were only humans, Earthlings, and they were ready for a fight. Aboard the flagship, Admiral Keith sat in stunned silence. Then, a hot, dark rage filled him. The sheer arrogance of these insects. "So be it," he snarled. "They have chosen annihilation." He turned to his second-in-command. "Begin the bombardment. Target their military sites first, then burn their cities to the ground. Show them the price of defiance." The order was given. Thousands of alien weapons began to charge. Targeting lasers painted locations all across the planet. And then, Earth punched back. It came from everywhere at once. Silent submarines surged from the ocean depths, launching swarms of missiles. Hidden silos on every continent cracked open. Stealth aircraft, tucked away in camouflaged hangars, roared into the sky. But the real gut punch, the surprise they never saw coming, came from space itself. For decades, we'd been putting up satellites, weather satellites, communication satellites, scientific probes. The Valkyrie had scanned them all and dismissed them as harmless junk. That was their first mistake, because half of those satellites were wolves in sheep's clothing. They were weapon platforms, railguns powered by micro-reactors, laser cannons disguised as sensor arrays, kinetic rods hidden inside comms dishes, and in a single, coordinated moment, they all woke up. The sky ignited. Missiles screamed up from the ground, while satellites rained fire down from orbit. The Valkyrie fleet was caught in a 360-degree kill box. Admiral Keith could only watch in horror as his ships began to detonate around him. The humans hadn't been preparing for days or weeks. They'd been preparing for years. "Return fire!" he screamed. His composure shattered. "Destroy those platforms! All ships, defensive formation, now!" The fleet scrambled to react. Their weapons were powerful, and they started knocking human missiles and satellites out of the sky by the thousands. But it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. For every one they destroyed, two more took its place, launched from a hidden cave or a deep-sea trench. And then came the real nightmare. Across the planet, in secret server farms and university basements, Earth's keyboard warriors launched their own attack. The best hackers in the world, pardoned for past crimes and united for one cause, had been dissecting the aliens' code for 3 days. They found a way in. The Valkyrie had never faced an enemy like this. Their cybersecurity was built to stop other advanced, orderly species. Human hackers weren't orderly. They were chaotic, creative, and utterly unpredictable. Minutes after the attack started, alien ships began to go dark. Their navigation systems fed them gibberish. Their weapons targeted empty space. Their comm channels flooded with static and nonsense. Admiral Keith watched his magnificent fleet, the pride of the Dominion, descend into absolute chaos. Squadrons flew in circles. Captains screamed for orders that never arrived. For 6 solid hours, the Valkyrie fleet was blind, deaf, and dumb. The humans did not waste a second. Every single weapon that could reach orbit was fired again and again. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a desperate, furious act of survival. When the aliens finally managed to reboot their systems and purge the human code, they saw the devastating cost. 3,000 of their ships were gone. turned into drifting metal coffins. Another 3,000 were heavily damaged. In 6 hours, the humans had cut their invasion force in half. Keith stood on his bridge, staring at the tactical map. He had started with over 8,500 ships. Now, he had just over 5,000, and the little blue planet below was still fighting back. He thought about his arrogant speech, his certainty of an easy victory. He had been wrong. About everything, the battle raged on. The humans were running low on ammo, their attacks becoming less frequent, but what they lacked in firepower, they made up for in sheer grit. Reports flooded Keith's screen that defied all logic. Human pilots were deliberately crashing their planes into his cruisers. Ground crews were manually launching missiles after their automated systems failed. It was madness. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. On Earth, General Vasquez knew they were on their last legs. Their grand surprise had worked, but it was a one-shot weapon. "That was our big punch," she said to the global leaders on her screen. "Now we have to outsmart him." The plan was simple, desperate, and utterly human. It was a bluff. The hackers went back to work, this time not to disrupt, but to create a ghost story. They began feeding fake energy signatures and comms chatter directly into the Valkyrie flagship's deep-range sensors. Data that painted a picture of a second, massive human fleet about to warp in from behind Mars, a fleet that didn't exist. Admiral Keith, his fleet in tatters, his confidence destroyed, saw the new contacts appear. A reserve force? He hadn't even considered it. These primitives were more cunning than he could have imagined. Faced with the choice of fighting a fresh enemy or retreating with what little he had left, the admiral, who had never known defeat, finally broke. "Recall the fleet," he whispered. "We are leaving." On the main screen in the Colorado bunker, the cloud of red dots stopped, hesitated, and then, one by one, they began to turn away. A stunned silence fell, then a single cheer, which grew into a roar that shook the very mountain. They had done it. They had won. Elena Vasquez looked at the image of the beautiful, wounded blue planet on the screen, a tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. Humanity had been saved, not by its weapons, but by its flaws, its stubbornness, its chaos, and the incredible things it could do when finally everyone decided to fight together. And somehow, through all the chaos, the human broadcasts never stopped. Their leaders were on every channel, their voices steady, telling their people to hold on, to keep fighting. Radios played defiant music. Televisions showed crayon drawings from children, pictures of alien ships exploding in bursts of color, and photos of human soldiers standing tall. It was absolute madness. It was strangely beautiful. It was terrifying. "What are these creatures?" Vithra whispered, standing beside Catharos on the ship's bridge. "Why in the worlds won't they just give up?" Catharos just shook his head, his eyes glued to the screens. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've conquered 12 worlds. I've fought 7 different species. Not a single one was like this. None of them ever fought so desperately when they had so little chance of winning." He gazed down at the swirling blue planet below. "They were never divided," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We saw their constant conflicts and thought it was a weakness. We were such fools. All those wars, they were just practice. They've been training for a fight like this since they lived in caves." He squeezed his eyes shut. "We haven't attacked a fractured civilization. We've attacked a planet of warriors, a species that has only ever known struggle and survival. and they won't stop fighting until every last one of them is dead." Thiara stood silent for a long moment, letting the horrifying realization sink in. Finally, she asked the one question that hung in the air like a shroud. Can we still win?" Kathis didn't answer. He wasn't sure he knew anymore. Down on Earth, General Vasquez looked over the damage reports. The counterattack had worked better than anyone had dared to hope. The aliens had lost thousands of ships. Their mighty fleet was in complete disarray. But humanity had paid a terrible price. Entire cities were engulfed in flames. Military bases were craters in the ground. Millions were already dead, with millions more certain to follow. And the aliens were still up there. 5,200 ships still hung in orbit. More than enough to burn the world to ash. "We hurt them," one of her officers said, his voice tight. "We hurt them bad." Vasquez gave a sharp nod. "Yes, but it's not enough. They'll regroup, they'll adapt, and when they do, they'll come at us with everything they have left." She stared at the world map, a heartbreaking mosaic of red markers over burning cities and the last known positions of human defenders. "We have to be ready. When they finally land their ground troops, we need to make them pay for every inch of soil, every street corner, every building, every single room." She turned to face her officers, her eyes blazing. "This is our home, and we will defend it with our last breath." Outside, the alien fleet glittered in the sky, a dark and silent promise. The siege of Earth had begun, but humanity was a very, very long way from being finished. The invasion started on a Thursday morning. 2 million Valkyrie soldiers dropped from the heavens, their landing craft streaking towards Earth like a storm of metal rain. Their primary targets were the major cities: New York, Beijing, Moscow, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, and dozens of others. Admiral Kethos watched from his command ship as his forces descended. This was the moment they had trained for. Ground combat, face-to-face battle, the kind of war that breaks the will of a population. In space, the humans had surprised him with their clever tricks and unexpected traps. But on the ground, his soldiers would finally show their true, undeniable strength. Or so he thought. The first landing craft touched down in New York's Central Park. 5,000 soldiers poured out, weapons raised, their polished armor glinting in the morning light. They expected to find a terrified populace, broken and ready to surrender. What they found instead was a city that had been turned into a fortress. Every skyscraper was a sniper's nest. Every street was a pre-sighted kill zone. Every window hid a rifle. The humans had used the last few days to prepare, digging trenches, welding barricades, and planting explosives in every strategic location they could find. The first Valkyrie squad started moving down Fifth Avenue. They made it exactly 3 blocks before the world exploded. Bullets rained down from every direction at once. Homemade bombs detonated under their feet, sending them flying. Soldiers fell, screaming into their comms. When the few survivors tried to retreat, they found their own landing craft engulfed in flames. Human fighters had snuck through the subway tunnels and attacked them from behind. The 5,000 elite soldiers who landed in Central Park were now trapped, surrounded, and systematically wiped out over the next 12 hours. It was the exact same story in every other city. In Beijing, the Valkyrie landed in Tiananmen Square. They planned to march through the city and secure it in a matter of hours. Instead, They found themselves lost in a deadly maze of ancient alleyways and winding streets. Human soldiers would pop out of nowhere, fire a few rounds, and then vanish into hidden passages and underground tunnels like ghosts. The Velkari had superior weapons. They had better armor. They had advanced communication systems and tactical computers that could predict any conventional move. None of it made a lick of difference. The humans knew their cities. They knew every back alley, every rooftop, every secret hiding place. They would strike with lightning speed and then melt away before the Velkari could even figure out where the attack came from. By the end of the first day, the Velkari had lost 20,000 soldiers in Beijing alone, and they only controlled 3 city blocks. In Moscow, the battle was even worse. The brutal Russian winter had come early, and the Velkari soldiers were completely unprepared for the biting cold. Their armor was designed for temperate climates. Their advanced equipment started to malfunction and fail in the freezing temperatures. The humans used this to their absolute advantage. They launched their attacks at night, when the cold was at its most vicious. They'd lead the Velkari on long chases through the frozen streets, only to fall back and watch as their enemies collapsed from hypothermia. They set fires just to draw the alien soldiers into deadly ambushes. They flooded entire streets with water that quickly turned into treacherous sheets of ice. The Russian commander, a young woman named Katya Vulov, became a legend for her ruthless tactics. She led her fighters through the sprawling Moscow subway system, hitting Velkari positions from below before disappearing back into the darkness. The aliens quickly learned to fear the sound of her voice crackling over their radios, calmly calling out targets for her hidden forces. "Let them freeze," she said in one broadcast they managed to intercept. "Let them feel what it's like to fight on our soil, in our weather, against our people. They wanted Earth so badly. Well, let them have a little taste of it." The Battle of Sao Paulo was what changed everything. The Velkari had committed 50,000 soldiers to the Brazilian city, their largest ground force on the entire planet. They were determined to overwhelm the defenders and establish a major base of operations. For 3 long days, they pushed their way into the city. They fought for every building, every street, battling fierce resistance the whole way. The human defenders kept falling back, taking devastating casualties. It finally looked like the Velkari were about to secure a real decisive victory. And that's when the trap snapped shut. General Vasquez had planned it down to the last detail. She had deliberately allowed the Velkari to advance, luring them deeper and deeper into the urban sprawl. She had evacuated most of the civilians. She had positioned her remaining forces in a massive ring around the invading army. On the 3rd day, she gave the order, "Attack." Humans poured in from every direction. And it wasn't just soldiers. It was the civilians who had refused to leave. Factory workers carrying hunting rifles, teachers armed with baseball bats and kitchen knives, grandmothers with homemade explosives strapped to their chests, walking calmly toward the enemy. The Velkari fought back with everything they had. Their plasma weapons cut down humans by the hundreds. But for every person who fell, 2 more seemed to rise up and take their place. They climbed over the bodies of their fallen friends and just kept coming. The battle raged for 18 straight hours. When it was finally over, not a single Velkari soldier in Sao Paulo was left alive. 50,000 of them, the largest alien force on the planet, had been completely and utterly destroyed. The human cost was staggering. Over 200,000 dead, and 3 times that many wounded. Almost a quarter of the city was in ruins, but high above the rubble, the Brazilian flag was still flying. When Catharus received the report, he just sat in his command chair in total silence for a long time. 50,000 soldiers gone. His best troops, his most seasoned units, wiped out by a mob of civilians with primitive weapons. "They took 10 casualties for every one of ours," Vathra said, her voice shaking. "They lost 200,000 people, and they're calling it a victory." Kethus finally spoke, his voice hollow. "They are calling it a great triumph." He shook his head, lost in disbelief. "What kind of species thinks that such losses are acceptable? What kind of species keeps fighting when the price is so impossibly high?" The weeks crawled by. The Velkari continued to push into human territory, paying for every single meter with their own blood. They managed to take a few cities, but at a horrific cost. They lost others completely. The map of Earth became a chaotic patchwork of controlled zones, contested areas, and places that were simply too deadly for their soldiers to even enter. And everywhere, without exception, the humans kept fighting. They fought with guns and bombs and missiles. They fought with knives and clubs and their bare hands. They fought in the streets, in the buildings, and in the dark tunnels beneath the ground. They fought in the forests and the mountains and the scorching deserts. They never, ever stopped fighting. Cathus got reports every single day detailing new attacks, new losses, new disasters. A supply convoy ambushed on a highway. A forward base overrun in the middle of the night. A supply ship shot down by a teenager with a missile launcher he'd built in his garage. His soldiers were beyond exhausted. They were terrified. They had been promised an easy conquest, a quick victory over a weak and divided species. Instead, they had been thrown into a meat grinder, a waking nightmare that had no end. Some soldiers just refused to fight anymore. Some were driven mad by the constant, unrelenting stress. Some took their own lives rather than face another day in this hell. The officers tried their best to maintain discipline, but it was getting harder and harder. The Velkari were not built for this kind of war. They were used to swift, overwhelming victories, to enemies who surrendered when faced with superior force. They had no idea how to fight an enemy that simply would not give up, no matter what. One night, Kethos walked through a crowded field hospital on one of his orbiting ships. The beds were filled with wounded soldiers, their bodies mangled and broken by human weapons. Many of them would not survive. He stopped beside a young soldier whose legs had been blown off by a hidden explosive. The boy, who was barely old enough to serve, looked up at him with hollow, empty eyes. "Admiral," the boy whispered, his voice cracking, "why wouldn't they just stop?" Admiral Keith had no answer. He'd seen countless species fold under the Dominion's might. The Tari, who surrendered when their capital was turned to ash. The Voreshi, who sued for peace after their fleet was shattered. The Kranthor, who simply laid down their arms when they saw the writing on the wall. None had fought like this. None had been willing to pay such an incredible price. Looking at the wounded soldiers all around him, he made a call. "Patch me through to all ground commanders," he told Thara. "We're starting withdrawal operations. Pull every last soldier back to the landing zones." Thara just stared. "Admiral, we're retreating?" "No," Keith said firmly. "We're cutting our losses. We can't win a ground war here. Every day we stay, we lose more troops for absolutely nothing. We have to change our strategy." He paced over to the main viewport, staring down at the burning world below. "Maybe we should just wipe them out from orbit, turn their cities to glass, and boil their oceans." He sighed. "But even then, I'm not convinced they'd stop fighting." He turned back to Thara. "Begin the withdrawal. We need to regroup, to think. We need to find a way to beat these creatures that doesn't involve bleeding out on their soil." The orders shot across the planet. Valkyrie forces began to fall back. They pulled out of Moscow, Beijing, and New York. They abandoned their forward bases, leaving equipment and fortifications behind. They even left their dead. Out of the 2 million soldiers who had first landed on Earth, fewer than 80,000 managed to scramble back to the ships. The rest were gone, killed, captured, or simply missing in action. 4 months. 4 months of brutal, relentless fighting. 4 months of fire, blood, and death. And somehow, the humans were still standing, still fighting, still refusing to back down. From the bridge of his ship, Keith watched the last transports limp home. His invasion force was a ghost of what it had been. His ground commanders were either dead or broken. His soldiers were just empty shells, and Earth remained unconquered. He had finally understood the truth about humanity. They weren't weak. They weren't divided. And they were anything but easy prey. They were, without a doubt, the most dangerous species the Dominion had ever encountered. And his mistake had been attacking them on their own turf. Admiral Cathoris stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, gazing at the wreckage of his fleet. The tactical display painted a grim picture of total disaster. He had warped into the Sol system with 9,700 warships. Now, floating in the space around Earth, fewer than 400 were even functional. The rest were just drifting junk, captured or too crippled to move. And of those 400, only a tiny fraction could actually make the journey home. The war had lasted 4 months. 4 months of fighting, dying, and losing. 4 months of watching his absolute certainty turn to dust. It was over. It didn't end with a glorious victory or even a dignified surrender. It ended with the quiet, crushing realization that he couldn't win. He couldn't even keep fighting. His fleet was shattered. His army was gone. His mission was a complete and utter failure. Thara approached him quietly. Her uniform was torn and filthy. She'd lost an arm in the chaos and now wore a crude replacement of metal and wire. She looked as exhausted as he felt. "Admiral," she said softly. "The engineers just finished their assessment. Only 17 ships can make the jump to light speed. The rest are too badly damaged. 17 ships. 17 out of 9,000. 700. Less than 0.2%. Cathoris closed his eyes. He thought of all the soldiers who had put their faith in him, of the families who had sent their children to serve under his command, of all the promises he'd made about an easy victory and a glorious conquest. "Prep those ships for departure," he said, his voice heavy. "Cram as many survivors aboard as you can. We're leaving." "And the other ships, sir? The ones that can't travel?" Cathoris was silent for a long, heavy moment. "The crews will have to make a choice. They can try to surrender to the humans, or—" He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. Thara nodded grimly. She understood. Some would rather die than fall into human hands. After everything they had witnessed, she couldn't blame them. The evacuation took 2 grueling days. 80,000 soldiers, The last remnants of a 2 million-strong invasion force were packed into 17 ships. They stood shoulder to shoulder in hallways and cargo bays, barely able to breathe. The air was thick with the stench of fear and defeat. Before giving the final order, Cthulhu broadcast one last message to the planet below. He felt he owed them that much. "People of Earth," he began, "this is Admiral Kethos. I came to your world with an army, fully intending to conquer you. I was wrong." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "You have taught me a valuable lesson. You've shown me that not every species can be broken. Not every world can be taken. Some people are just too stubborn, too brave, too willing to die for what they believe in." He took one last look at the beautiful blue planet. "I don't know if our paths will ever cross again. I have no idea what the future holds for either of our peoples. But I want you to know this. I have fought wars all across this galaxy. I have conquered worlds and crushed armies. In all my years, I have never, ever faced an enemy like you." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "You have earned my respect and my fear." He cut the transmission. Then he gave the order. "All ships, begin jump sequence. We're going home." The 17 ships aligned their engines. Reality itself seemed to twist and distort around them. And then they were gone, leaving behind the shattered husks of 9,683 warships and the bodies of nearly 2 million soldiers. Earth had survived. Keith spent most of the long trip home in his quarters, writing his report for the High Council. It was the hardest thing he had ever written. He detailed the asteroid attacks and the nuclear barrages. He wrote about the cyber warfare, the orbital weapons platforms, the brutal ground invasion, and the massacre at Sao Paulo. But more than anything, he wrote about the humans themselves. "They are unlike any species in the Dominion's archives," he wrote. "They aren't rational, at least not in any way we understand it. They don't weigh costs and benefits like civilized beings. They fight with their hearts, not with their heads." He thought of the pilots who deliberately flew their planes into his ships, of the civilians who charged his armed positions with nothing but kitchen knives. He remembered the children who drew pictures of burning alien ships and taped them to their windows. "We thought their internal divisions made them weak. We were fools. Those divisions were just practice for the real war. They have been fighting themselves since the dawn of their history. Conflict is in their blood. Battle is etched into their very bones." He paused, recalling the final bloody days. "They took 10 casualties for every one of ours. They would lose hundreds of thousands in a single engagement, and they would call it a victory. They celebrated it. They sang songs for their fallen and swore to avenge them." He shook his head in disbelief. No species should be this willing to die. No species should embrace loss on that scale. But the humans do. They always have. They clawed their way to the top of a death world, fighting everything, including each other, and it only made them stronger. He wrote his final stark recommendation. The Sol system must be placed under permanent quarantine. No Valkyrie ship should ever enter human space again. Not for war, not for trade, not for any reason at all. Mark them as too dangerous to contact. Mark their world as forbidden. He signed the report, adding a final thought. "These beings cannot be conquered. They can only be survived." The High Council read the report with stunned disbelief. 9,700 ships sent, 17 returned. 2 million soldiers deployed. 80,000 survived. The single greatest invasion force in Dominion history, utterly annihilated by one primitive species. Some on the council screamed for Cthulhu to be executed for his failure. Others demanded they send another, even larger fleet to finish what he had started. But the wiser ones listened. They studied his report. They watched the battle recordings. They saw the footage of humans dying by the thousands, yet still refusing to surrender. They saw the look in the humans' eyes, that absolute, unshakable will to fight to the very end. And they understood. The motion passed without a single objection. A massive beacon was built and dispatched to the edge of human space. It broadcast a simple message in every known language, a warning for all who might wander by. Danger. This system is quarantined. The species within cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be conquered. They cannot be controlled. They fight without logic. They die without regret. Approach at your own peril. The beacon then added one last line, translated from the Admiral's own report. These beings can only be survived. On Earth, the celebration lasted for weeks. People danced in the streets of their ruined cities. They hugged total strangers, wept for the dead, and thanked whatever gods they prayed to for their impossible survival. General Vasquez came home a hero. She stood before the United Nations, receiving medals from every country that still had a government to give one. She listened to the endless speeches, the praise, and the promises of a brighter future. But when she finally got home, she just sat in her quiet garden and looked up at the stars. She thought about everything that had happened, all that had been lost, and everything that had been won. The aliens were gone, yes, but they would tell others about Earth. They would spread stories about the stubborn little species that refused to be conquered. And sooner or later, someone else would come. Someone more curious, more ambitious, someone who thought they could succeed where the Valkyrie had failed. Humanity had to be ready. She pulled out her phone and called the new Secretary General. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. "About the future, about defense, about what happens when the next fleet arrives." The Secretary General sighed on the other end. "Can't we just have a few months of peace, General?" Vasquez looked back up at the silent, watching stars. "Somewhere out there," she said. "They're already telling their story. The party's over. Now the real work begins. They thought they could wipe us out, and we just roll over and die. But you can't do that to humanity. My grandmother used to say, 'The universe knows we exist now. They know we can fight, and they know we can win. The war isn't over. It's just getting started.' And you know what? She was right. If you want to see how we took the fight to them, stick around for the next 60 seconds. 50 years after they nearly erased us, we launched our very first interstellar warship, the UES Defiance. This thing was a beast, armed with weapons that would have looked like straight-up magic to the heroes who fought off the Valkyrie invasion. It was faster, tougher, and deadlier than anything Earth had ever dreamed of. And on its bridge, a young captain, whose own grandmother died in the rubble of Sao Paulo, gave the order to jump. "So, where to, Captain?" her first officer asked. The captain turned, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face. "We're going to introduce ourselves to the neighbors," she said. Make sure they know we remember what they did, and make damn sure they never, ever forget who we are." With a flash, the ship vanished into the black. Humanity wasn't waiting for another attack. We were taking the war to the galaxy, and the galaxy was about to get a rude awakening. Out in the dead of space, that old Valkyrie warning beacon kept screaming its message. Ships from a dozen different worlds would show up, read the warning, and immediately turn tail. None of them wanted to mess with the creatures the beacon described, and its final, chilling line repeated over and over, forever. They cannot be conquered. They can only be survived. And down below, Earth healed its scars, built its fleets, and got ready for round 2. We were ready. We had always been ready. It's what we do best,